Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. You know, the relationship between food and cancer has been a complicated one, I think especially in the eyes of the public. We all want that magic bullet, the one food or diet that's the answer to preventing this disease. And we'll latch on to the newest so-called superfood. Or we try the latest dieting craze, hoping it'll shed pounds, make us healthier, give us a longer life. There's so much what I would call noise out there regarding food and what keeps us healthy or not, that it's tough to separate facts from fiction. So today, I have invited Rachel Murphy to give us the lowdown. Rachel is an associate professor in the School of Population and Public Health at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me, Mary.
So let's just start off with, I guess, the big question, which is how strong is that relationship between what we eat and cancer?
There's really consistent evidence that what we eat matters with respect to cancer. It does help reduce the risk of cancer by as much as about 40 to 50%, along with a healthy lifestyle. So things like maintaining a healthy body weight, being physically active, as well as limiting alcohol consumption.
40 to 50%? Like, to me, that sounds pretty big, right? Like 50% is half of 100%. So it sounds like it's significant. Okay. So let me ask you this. I don't know. I mean, is it the actual research that's been conflicting? Is it perhaps the kind of research that we hear about? And so maybe we make assumptions about that. Or is it just the way the media presents the evidence that has caused a lot of this confusion? And I would say even distrust about evidence. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a little bit of everything. So one, I think some of our understanding of how diet relates to cancer and might reduce the risk of cancer or increase the risk of cancer has changed. And I think that's a natural thing that happens. We become more knowledgeable and better about conducting studies, about measuring dietary intake, measuring cancer over time. But some of it is also, there's a lot of noise out there, as you said in the introduction, that there's a lot of non-evidence-based information out there. Sometimes the messages really get distorted as well in the media, which is unfortunate, but it does absolutely add to that kind of mistrust.
Yeah, and I think, what can confuse people is when, I'll just give an example, you have one food and then that is touted, let's say, to lower the risk of cancer one week. And then the next time they hear about it, now it doesn't, or it maybe even increases your risk of cancer or, vice versa. I think about, let's say, tofu. That's a good example. It's caused, some confusion, like back and forth. Is it good? Is it not good? Like, what do you say about, those kinds of examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, relates to soy. And, sometimes we feel like the messaging is around eating more soy. Sometimes it's, soy might be, potentially problematic if you consume a lot of it. And I think you really need to take these kind of single studies in the overall tapestry. So what does the overall evidence say? Not just focusing on one specific study, is really thinking about what is the greater body of evidence pointing to. And I think also some of this also stems from, focus on a single food or a single nutrient, when really that's not how we eat. We don't eat just tofu. That it's important to consider kind of the overall dietary intake and overall diet pattern of individuals. And that's really where the field is moving toward.
Yeah, one of the things that I quickly learned as well when I was starting to report on health issues is that there can be a big difference in studies that are released that only involved animals, in the lab, as opposed to studies on humans.
Yeah, and I think some of that can absolutely contribute to some of the perhaps mixed evidence or mixed messages that we sometimes see. So it's important that, animal models are a very important piece of the evidence that can really help us establish causation, but We also need to consider, is the metabolism the same between animal models and humans? Is the amount that animals are being fed relevant to what humans would be consuming as well?
Yeah, so let's just, dig a little deeper about foods, first of all, that can increase our risk of cancer. Where is the strongest evidence there?
So some of the strongest evidence is around processed meat and red meat. So the International Agency for Cancer Research, or IARC, has come out in the past couple of years identifying red meat and processed meat as being potentially carcinogenic, meaning that it's known to cause cancer. So those are foods they suggest to limit. There's also recommendations around limiting the consumption of fast food, of sugary food. So things that are more calorically dense, because we know that can contribute to weight gain, and weight gain and overweight and obesity are strong risk factors for many of the most common cancers.
And when you say that red meat can be carcinogenic, like without getting too into scientific jargon, what's actually happening? So when we eat that red meat and it is carcinogenic, what's actually going on? What is it doing to our cells?
Yeah, that's a good question. So carcinogens can be formed or added during food processing, or also during actual cooking of it. So if you think about, often people will barbecue meat, for example, and that can cause chemicals to be produced. So specifically when meat is cooked at high temperatures, and this can result in damaging of some of the cells. And in particular, this is most often linked to increased risk of colorectal cancer, so damaging cells within the colon, for example.
Okay, so when you eat it, it's actually damaging, hurting, altering our cells. Is that what's
Right.
going on? Yeah. And when you
Yeah.
say barbecuing, is that like any kind of barbecuing or like burnt meat?
That's kind of the burnt. So that char is that kind of that one that's really tasty, but is also, when meat is cooked at high temperatures, is generally when these they're called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's generally when these are produced.
And what is it about actually processing foods that can make them higher risk of cancer?
So often things like nitrates or nitrates are added during that processing kind of process, that for lack of a better word, but it's done to extend the shelf life. But this can also lead to formation of cancer-causing chemicals such as nitroso compounds.
Okay, so red meat, you say the processing of foods, there's pretty strong evidence, right, for those
Right.
increasing your risk of cancer. Anything else that would have very good evidence behind it?
So ultra processed foods are another one. So building on kind of that processed meat. So similar to that idea, but thinking more about the ultra processed food consumption. So again, thinking about, highly processed foods like baked goods, for example, have been, receiving a lot of attention lately for potentially also increasing the risk. And again, particularly colorectal cancer, which is one of the most common cancers.
Mm. I want to ask you too about alcohol, because that's been in the news recently. There were new Canadian guidelines that were announced for alcohol consumption, and it caused a lot of talk and backlash as well among many people. And the research said that no amount of alcohol of any kind is good for your health, and that even 1 to 2 drinks per week can represent a low risk of harm. So these were the guidelines that came out. Now, I'd like to know, what do you make of those guidelines?
Yeah, I think the guidelines are really strong. It's one of the challenges, I think, of working in cancer prevention in the realm of diet, is that a lot of these guidelines are perhaps unpopular. So alcohol is one of the most commonly used substances in Canada, so it can be hard to hear that messaging. However, the evidence is quite robust. So it is true that drinking any type of alcohol really increases the risk of many of most common cancers, particularly breast cancer, liver and colorectal cancer, stomach cancer. So the less you drink, the more you do reduce your risk.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you were to take that, you're right, just as the research is, and you say it's robust. Okay, sure. But, we live our lives not in a lab. And not in isolation of one particular factor, right? So it's interesting. I was talking a lot about that with people I know, with friends, and one of my friends said to me, and he's also a professor, but not of nutrition, but he said he doesn't dispute the evidence at all, but he wonders whether, should you be factoring quality of life into that equation as well? So let's say if you use alcohol, and not to any great extent, but you do use it in a responsible way for enjoyment, for socialization, for relaxation. Should that also be factored in to your decision of whether to drink or not?
I mean, ultimately, it's a personal decision. And I think there's a lot of aspects around alcohol, as well as, what you consume more broadly around diet. A lot of this is very much social behaviors. There's enjoyment in what you are eating, or there should be, hopefully, as well as, there is a mental health component of, you drink alcohol, or if people might choose to drink alcohol in a social situation or for various aspects that make them feel good. And at the end of the day, it is a personal decision. And I think the most important thing is being able to kind of weigh the evidence and decide your own kind of risk benefit and what you feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now much of your research focuses on reducing our risk of cancer. So, yeah, the other big question, I guess, is, are there foods that can actually prevent cancer?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to, this kind of superfoods and specific diets. I mean, my message would be more around thinking about not necessarily specific foods, but kind of your overall consumption of, it's a balance. So thinking about consuming more fruits and vegetables, choosing foods that are higher in fiber, and also choosing, plant-based protein if possible. Making water your drink of choice. So very much aligning with the guidelines for Canada's food guide, for example, is a good place to start.
But would there be certain foods, though, that are even kind of more rich in those, chemicals that can help with cancer prevention?
I mean, certainly there's been a lot of focus on like antioxidant rich diets, for example. Like the Mediterranean diet is often touted as being quite healthy with respect to both cardiovascular disease and cancer. And some of that is thought to be because of it's high in antioxidants. There's anti-inflammatory nutrients. So there are certain nutrients that are particularly important to include. Fiber is another one. But it's not necessarily that there's, one specific food that is the key.
Yeah, because I mean, I've heard so much about the Mediterranean diet over the years, and I think I just heard about it recently too, that there was some other study that again, confirmed that was one of the best diets. I mean, I don't know whether you kind of buy into that. Oh, the Mediterranean diet, if you can do it, that would be the best diet. Like, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think a lot of the aspects of the Mediterranean diet are very similar to what the guidelines are for healthy eating in Canada, as well as in other places in the world. So thinking about high intake of vegetables, high intake of legumes, fresh fruit, very minimally processed, kind of moderate consumption of fish and dairy. So a lot of those aspects of the Mediterranean diet very much track with kind of our general health recommendations. And I think in that sense, if we think about even loosely following it, it would be feasible for many individuals, or they could see at least parts of that diet that they might be able to follow.
So have there been any foods that have been shown to actually, they can kill cancer cells or even just slow down the progress of cancer?
Not that I'm aware of that has the strongest evidence around it. And I think one of the things that's challenging is that if we think about how would we study diet and cancer, it can be really difficult within a human population. So it's very challenging to do like a randomized controlled trial, which is considered the gold standard, just because it takes cancer so long to develop. And it's really not feasible to assign somebody to a diet and then follow them for the decades that it takes cancer to develop. So that's one of the challenges within the field, is that often we rely on observational studies, which are conducted in big cohorts. And it's difficult to ascribe causation to that. So that's where we look at the animal models. So it's really around looking at kind of the totality of, is it consistent messaging around what we're finding in animal studies as well as in these kind of cohort studies. And again, I think it's more around kind of the overall dietary patterns versus specific food.
Okay, so would you say, is the evidence stronger on foods that can contribute or raise the risk of cancer as opposed to foods that prevent cancer?
I wouldn't say that it's stronger. No, I mean, I think that, we know that fiber, for example, is really important, especially for reducing the risk of colorectal cancer. And again, kind of on the flip side, there's the red and processed meat, saturated fat. But we also know fruits and vegetables are very important for helping reduce the risk of many different types of cancer. So I think it's probably equivocal.
Yeah, and again, I guess, yeah, it's such a complicated thing to study for the very reasons you point out, right? You have a diet, you have many different foods involved. Cancer can take a long time to develop. And so, I guess with time and population, you introduce so many factors, right, that might contribute to either preventing or causing cancer. Because of that, and then every person is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've studied metabolism as well. Like, what about when you factor that in as well? So, there's food, and then there's you and your intake, but there's metabolism, and then there's also the environment, and who knows what is contributing from the environment, how much sunlight you're getting. What about the hormones, in the food? And like, what about all that too?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. And I think that's where, it very quickly becomes overwhelming for people. And I think sometimes it can be difficult having this one size fits all approach of, we know eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more fiber, and it's not very personalized. And, that's helpful on a population level when we're targeting kind of the overall population and promoting health. But on the individual level, it can be difficult to have individuals feel like that resonates with them. And certainly you're right. There are variations. So you and I might eat the same meal and we would have a very different metabolic response to it. Some of that is our genetic differences. And there's a whole host of other environmental exposures that can impact that as well. So it is challenging to study because cancer is a very multifactorial disease, and there's lots of different heterogeneity even within a cancer. So somebody could have breast cancer, and the other person who would have breast cancer, and their tumors could be completely different. So it's challenging to say the least.
Yeah. So when you do these population studies, and I'm assuming that you need a lot of people. There's probably a lot of people, right? You need over time.
Yeah. So one of the populations that I work a lot with is called the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow's Project. And that's a study that's a longitudinal cohort study, which we're so fortunate to have something of that scale within Canada, because exactly as you said, it requires studying a large number of people over time. So there's over 330,000 Canadians who have volunteered to partake in that study. And that's been an incredibly resourceful population for studying diet and cancer, among other kind of exposures in relationship to cancer and chronic disease outcomes. So things like that are really helpful for researchers like myself.
So if you say 40 to 50% can be influenced by food, is that right for cancer risk? 40 to 50%?
So it's kind of overall lifestyle. So food,
it's overall
physical activity, and body weight. So those are all kind of intrinsically linked.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say, so 40 to 50% due to lifestyle. And the examples you just gave are examples that are within our control, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's
so
somewhat, I should say. Body weight, I'm sure that's debatable. But okay, so then if it's 40 to 50%, what makes up the other 50%?
Yeah, so some of that is genetic changes. So there's about 10% of cancers can be caused by inherited genetic changes. And then the vast majority also have roots in and environmental exposures, for example. And some of it is just also random mutations as well.
Yeah, you see, so even though, 50% lifestyle sounds significant, there's still another 50% that you have to account for. And a lot of that seems to be out of our control, isn't it?
Yes. And, the number one risk factor for cancer is age. So as we age, we have more kind of likelihood of genetic changes that might actually contribute to carcinogenesis. So that's the number one. And of course, it's not modifiable. So there's nothing we can do about our age, even though we all try to.
Yeah. And, I guess it's just because it is so complicated and everybody is different, because you talk about even genetics, like, maybe somebody sadly, got just drew the wrong straw and was born with a high risk of cancer because it runs in their family for a certain kind of cancer, and then I think too we all know examples of people who've led the worst lifestyle, right? They drink, they do drugs, they eat unhealthy foods. I think about a lot of rock stars, and yet, wow, they live for a long time and they go on their 10th world tour, and yet we know someone as well who seem to have done all the right things. And then they die of cancer at like age 50 or something. So and I'm sure people say that to you too, right? As a researcher. Yeah, but how does that explain all those people, who didn't lead a good lifestyle and the people who did, but they still got cancer? It doesn't, it's this idea that, 1+1, if I do things right, should equal 2, but it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this is the hard part about, cancer prevention is that, I think there's still a huge proportion that are potentially modifiable. And I think that that can be very empowering that, even if you have a higher genetic risk, for example, there are things that you can do to reduce your risk. And of course, it can also be disheartening to feel like you did the right thing and you still, developed not just cancer, but, something like cardiovascular disease, for example. Diet is part of it, but it's not all of it. But I think it's a bit of a challenge that, I think if there are ways that you can reduce your risk, then, that I would encourage people to take that on, and to try and have that power over your health. But of course, it is just one aspect of it.
Yeah. It just seems so unfair, doesn't it? For the people who do all the right things and like, oh my gosh, I could have gone crazy all my life if I'd only, if I knew what my genetic profile and everything else added up to, all the environmental factors. The other thing I wanted to ask you too is we've heard more and more about, and I don't think this is your area of expertise, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on it, about stress and the toxic effects of stress on our health. And I just wonder, because there seems to be more and more interest and I'm assuming studies on stress, do we know anything about the relationship between stress and cancer? I don't know how strong the evidence is on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting kind of emerging evidence around, stress and sleep and mental health, for example. I had a graduate student who just did a study looking at mental health and whether mental health is a risk factor for cancer. And if so, why? And I think some of this is that we do see a lot of kind of clustering of health behaviors. So stress, sleep, mental health. Those are all very closely patterned with, physical activity, diet, and body weight. People who have more stress tend to have, less healthy diets, tend to have disordered sleep. So it can be really hard to understand kind of which of these factors are contributing to health risk, or perhaps it's a constellation of these factors. So it can be difficult to tease it apart, but certainly I think it's a nice move towards understanding, that we need to work less in isolation and think more holistically about kind of all of the different exposures that an individual has, and how that relates to cancer.
Okay, so your student is studying. Has this student finished the study about mental health and cancer?
They did, yeah. So what they found was that individuals with certain types of mental health kind of disorders, so particularly anxiety and depression, did have an increased risk of some of the most common cancers, so specifically lung cancer and prostate cancer. A lot of that, though, was actually contributable or could be contributed to smoking behavior. So that the individuals who were more likely to have anxiety and depression were also more likely to smoke. And that was likely contributing to their increased cancer risk. So it's hard to tease apart these kind of behaviors.
Yeah. I would assume, I'm only going to assume, but that smoking and cancer has the most evidence behind it, that is the strongest link. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So smoking
Okay.
is the strongest.
Yeah.
It's the number one risk factor for lung cancer. About 75 to 80% of all lung cancers occur in people who have smoked.
Okay. And what about sun and skin cancer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Very strong evidence for sun exposure and melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, that whole area. You say that it's growing between those like mental health, stress, other areas that perhaps before we never even imagined that they would contribute to cancer.
Yeah, and I think, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot more awareness around kind of what are the long-term health impacts of, mental health and sleep and anxiety and all these kind of things that we saw uptick really during the pandemic.
And again, we probably know people, maybe we're those people, but we can become obsessed with healthy dieting, making sure that our environment is healthy in order to reduce the risk of cancer. Um, and I just wonder, what's your message to people who can become really preoccupied with that?
I think so. There is a term, so orthorexia has been recognized as it's this unhealthy obsession with kind of eating healthy, and certainly that I think there is recognition that is becoming more common.
Is that right? I didn't know. I never even heard that term.
Yeah. So it's definitely becoming more common. So you see that sometimes with people who are preoccupied or fixated on perhaps a particular type of diet. So veganism or, following the ketogenic diet, for example. Not to say that everyone who does those diets is fixated in that way, but you do see that people who have orthorexia are more likely to kind of be fixated on specific aspects of their diet. So I don't know that I have any advice. I'm not I think often perhaps some formalized counseling is required to kind of help move beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I'm guessing that perhaps there are other things involved with those kinds of fixations, not just that you want to eat healthily, that there might be other factors going on in those people's lives that might be contributing to this fixation. Do we know?
Yeah, I think, eating behavior is very complex. It's one of those challenging things where we all need to do it to survive. And yeah, there's a lot of different factors that go into what an individual chooses, both at an individual level as well as kind of more broadly at a population level and a systems level of, access and affordability and all those other aspects. But certainly there's an emotional aspect to what we eat as well that plays into things like that.
So do you know, is it on the rise significantly?
I don't know off the top of my head, but certainly I think there was a terminology when I was going to school that I had never heard of before. I don't know what the prevalence is.
And I'm just wondering, what do you think could be contributing to an increase in that?
I think there is a lot more kind of visibility and attention on food and specific diets, especially in social media. You see a lot of kind of channels and kind of posts and lots of kind of influencers that are, fixated on a specific way of eating as being the way to eat to be healthy and things like that. So perhaps that is, quite influential, especially for the younger generation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think too, it's easy to say to people, oh, you should follow a healthy diet and lifestyle. But of course, we all know, because we go through this, that it's so hard to change our behaviors, especially when it's giving up things we really love, like ice cream, or maybe we like sitting on the couch and watching, the latest streaming series on Netflix or whatever. And I have wondered whether, because of the pandemic, I don't know if you get any sense, or maybe it's just too soon since we are still officially in the pandemic, whether it's becoming even harder for people to make that change into a more healthy lifestyle. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes too, we put too much onus on an individual to make that kind of healthy change. One, I think that healthy changes don't need to be a huge shift, that even small changes can be meaningful. So even choosing things less often. So, have the ice cream, but choose it less often. And that can be meaningful for health. But I also think that especially, as of late, we see the prices of groceries are just skyrocketing, that being able to afford to make those healthy choices, is not something that a lot of people are being priced out of, choosing like the fruits and vegetables at the grocery store have doubled in price. I have two young kids who eat their own body weight in fruit, and I have noticed it on my grocery bill for sure. So I think that, it traditionally we've always put the onus on the individual to make those changes, but I think we also really need to recognize that it's not always possible for people to make those changes because of these external factors.
Yeah. Yeah. And tell us about the research you're doing now and what excites you the most about it.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I'm doing now is kind of around that systems approach, is understanding how the areas in which we live really help shape people's dietary access and dietary intake. So how can we actually start to move the needle more so in a way that's a lot more impactful? And I think the key to that is really improving access and affordability to healthy foods to allow people to make healthy eating the easy choice.
Oh, so when you say where, do you mean geographically?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is interesting. So that makes sense. There's probably a relationship between cancer and where you live, right?
Yeah, so there are,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think a lot of it is patterned by socioeconomic status, for example, that we see, overall people's health. There are overall health differences, but we also have a general idea from other countries. We don't have great data in Canada right now, but that's something that we're hoping to change. Is really understanding, how does access and affordability to kind of healthy or versus unhealthy foods. I don't always like using that language, but, how does that kind of shape dietary intake, and really helping to understand, how can we provide the broader structural supports so that people are able to make these choices and make them easily.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking about one of the factors too. When you say accessibility, like what if you live somewhere and you can easily walk to the store that has all kinds of fruits and vegetables? Or what if you live somewhere and you actually have to get in a car because it's too far to walk to obtain those vegetables?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly we see that in northern areas in Canada as well. The price of soda is much less expensive than water, for example. So, is it really helpful for us to be telling people, make water your drink of choice? It's just not feasible for some individuals as well. So, I think knowing what to eat is only half the battle. That we have to give people the tools to be able to actually enact that. So that's the work that we're hoping to get underway shortly, is to have a better understanding of kind of the environments in which people live and how that's shaping their dietary intake.
What do you find as a researcher? Because you've been doing this for a little while now. What is the most frustrating thing about doing this kind of research?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of non-evidence based information out there, and especially in the area of diet. That sometimes I hesitate to tell people that I work in the realm of diet and cancer prevention, because you might get an eye roll, or you
Yeah.
might get, people start telling you all these like wild things that they're eating. And I'm like, oh, okay. That I think is a challenge. And I think, it can be frustrating at times that, science moves slowly. And I think the pace at which, kind of diet and that, kind of common fads, move a lot faster than kind of the evidence base. So I think sometimes
Yeah.
it's hard to keep up and say, well, we don't quite have the evidence there to say, that a paleo diet is more helpful than this diet, for example. And I think that is what contributes to a lot of kind of skepticism, perhaps, around and diet and cancer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think many of us really have this love-hate relationship with food, right? I mean, it's essential, as you say, we got to eat it, but then we really want that magic bullet. We want to know that what we're doing, well, this is really going to do X. It's going to make us healthier. It's going to prevent cancer. It's going to help us live longer, all those things. But it's, as you say, it's not that simple.
Yeah. And I think, if we think about prevention of disease, it's also a difficult thing to study because in essence, your success is an absence of something. So you don't want to find anything. And that can also be a bit of a challenge, but it's the diet tends to be that everyone is an expert problem is how I term it. Yeah.
So I asked you what was frustrating. What would you say is the most, exciting thing about research, sort of where it's moving? Like what area do you find, very exciting and hopeful, and maybe, where you hope we might be in the next 5 to 10 years regarding food and lifestyle and disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the areas that we're starting to work in, and I think is really exciting, is we are looking a lot about kind of understanding that differences in metabolic response to diet. So, kind of what you mentioned before, and the one area that we've been focused on is the gut microbiome, for example. So, we know that the gut microbiome can both affect how diets are metabolized, and diet also shapes the composition of the gut microbiome. And this is something that is really a completely new field in the last couple of decades. It's really started to bring a new understanding of, how is diet metabolized in our body, and, how is it controlled? How does it control, distal parts of our metabolism and possibly disease development. So I think there's a lot to still be learned there, but it's a really promising area. And I think thinking about can we start to manipulate the diet and have an impact on kind of selective members in our gut, and what will that impact be on health? It's a really interesting area, and one I think we don't know yet, but it will be interesting to look in the next couple of decades to see.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. You're right. I mean, I hear so much about it now. Do we have any strong evidence right now coming out of that regarding microbiome and also disease?
Yeah, so we have a study in our group right now where we're trying to understand the contribution of the gut microbiome to the development of breast cancer. So there are members in the gut that can control estrogen metabolism, and estrogen is one of the causal risk factors for breast cancer. So there's a really interesting link there. There's pretty strong evidence as well around the role of the gut microbiome, and particularly fermenting fiber and the subsequent impact that has on colorectal cancer. So that tends to be a very important mechanism of how fiber is connected to colorectal cancer. So a lot of interesting work there. It's still kind of in its infancy, but in areas outside of this, so the gut microbiome and colorectal cancer and fiber are pretty well established. But I think that other areas are really just starting to branch out. So it'll be exciting to see.
Yeah, and what do you think? What do you think about the proliferation of all these fermented foods?
I mean, I think it's interesting. It's again another trend I think that has happened, and I think we don't know yet. It's one of those where I think people are doing the studies now, and it's hard to have the evidence to kind of keep up with the demand and the shift in the public towards certain types of foods or diets, for example. But I mean, certainly it seems like it does help, upregulate or result in higher levels of kind of these more beneficial gut microbes. So possibly, some health benefits. Again, it can be challenging when we're looking at measuring long-term health outcomes, but it does seem promising.
Oh yeah, and one of the things I wanted to ask you, the thinking used to be calories in, calories out. Well, can you update me on that? Is that still true, or has the thinking changed on that?
I mean, I think that's in essence, so the calories in, calories out, meaning you're in energy balance. And yes, I remember seeing that in my undergrad slides. It was like a teeter totter of like, how do we balance? And I think it's simplistic. I mean, by and large, that's kind of how our bodies kind of maintain our body weight. It's homeostasis. But it's not that simple, of course,
Yeah.
that, the calories in for myself is not the same amount as what another individual
Right.
needs. So that there's quite a bit of individual variation there.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We were talking about this the other day, and I just thought, oh, that must have been updated since I was taught that. Because when I think about calories that I consume, and then a friend of mine consumes, I feel as if she's handling it a different way than I am. And for some reason, right, like maybe those calories in, I expend a lot faster than she does.
Yeah, absolutely. So, individuals have different metabolic rates. So, meaning, what is your kind of metabolism of the fuel that you're putting into your body? How do you respond to exercise? We know individuals have different responses to that as well. So there's a lot of individual heterogeneity. So I think it's a simplistic way, I think, of perhaps thinking about what to put in versus kind of what to expend. That overall holds true, but it is, of course, much more complicated than
Yeah.
that.
So finally, I mean, we've discussed so many different things. What do you think is the most important message that you can leave people with regarding what they eat, and how to stay healthy and perhaps even prevent risk of cancer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think I like to go back to that, the small changes do matter. I think that, perhaps people might put off making a change because they feel like they have to give up bread and processed meat. They have to give up alcohol. You need to be, running 30 minutes a day. And, while all those things are beneficial, even small changes can help. And the other thing is that, really choosing something that's sustainable in the long term. So these are ideally, lifelong behaviors. So not something that you can't stick to the rest of your life. And I think that's particularly true for diet is, a lot of these specific diets, people might do well on or feel like they're, effective, but if they're not effective in the long term, I think that's really what I would encourage people to do if they're thinking about these kind of long-term health impacts, like cancer, for example.
And is it never too late? I mean, have we done studies that have good evidence showing that, like, let's say somebody who has had an unhealthy lifestyle actually changes their behavior, I don't know, let's say in midlife, they're middle-aged and they choose to adopt more of a healthy diet and they start exercising. Can we actually reverse certain effects?
That's a great question. And, I think there's kind of two folds to that. I think one, we need to start a lot earlier than what we think. So a lot of these kind of health behaviors really carry throughout life. So we know, for example, in children and adolescents, a lot of their eating behaviors, I'm sure we all have our kind of comfort foods from childhood that they maintain or being our comfort foods. And same, we know that body weight tends to track over time. So, and physical activity, again, it becomes much more habitual and that carries over time. So one, I think we need to be thinking much younger than, if you think about cancer, it's really, a disease that is most common in individuals 50 and older. But it seems at odds to be thinking about, prevention within kind of children and adolescents and often kind of young adults like here at the university. But it does really matter. We should focus kind of younger. That said, I think it is never too late. There have been some studies that have looked at individuals who have engaged in lifestyle changes and have experienced weight loss and even into their 70s, for example, and that has had an impact on a lower risk of cancer kind of moving forward. So I think that's also a nice message is, start early, but it's never too late.
And what about with your work? Would you say your work has it actually affected you personally, the way you live your life?
I drink a lot less alcohol now.
Yeah, well, there you go, and you're still having fun, I'm assuming, despite that.
Well, no, I am.
Yeah. This was a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much for joining us, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
That's Rachel Murphy. She's an associate professor at the School of Population and Public Health in the Faculty of Medicine at UBC. For more information about Rachel Murphy and her work, please check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed our program, and we'll see you back here next time.